Hey, Dan Beagleman here. In this video, I'll show you some patterns for whole tone scales and how Rick Derringer made use of whole tone scale patterns to highlight some of his solo spots in many live performances. Okay, on to whole tone scales. What is a whole tone scale? A whole tone scale is a scale made up of whole tones. What is a whole tone? A whole tone is equivalent to two frets on the guitar. Because every fret is a half tone or a semitone, every two frets would be a whole tone. All scales are made up of a pattern of steps, whole steps, half steps, sometimes a step and a half. Okay, so a scale, any scale, is going to be you hit a note and then you play some series of or some sequence of steps, and then when you get to the octave, you have the scale completed. For example, a major scale, that we all know, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. That's a C major scale, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. And it's made up of a pattern of whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. What that means is, I hit my C note, the next note I'll play a C major scale on one string, just to demonstrate. The pattern I played, as I just mentioned, is whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. In other words, I play a C note, the next step, or the next note is a whole step higher, which is two frets, another whole step, two frets, a half step, which is F, whole step, G, whole step, A, whole step, B, half step, C. So if I play a note and play the next note a whole step higher, half step, whole, 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 half, I have what sounds like a major scale. So every scale has a pattern to it. Most scales that we use, the major scale and the modes derived from the major scale and alterations on those are basically going to be 7-tone scales. You play 7 tones and then on the 8th tone you reach the octave. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, then we have what's called symmetrical scales. Symmetrical scales are scales where the pattern is going to be uniform. As I just mentioned, the major scale is made up of whole steps and half steps. Symmetrical scales are uniform in that it's the same amount of steps, or the step distance is the same for every scale. And the main two are the chromatic scale and the whole tone scale. A chromatic scale is made up of half steps. In other words, if I play a note and then I play a half step higher or one fret and just keep going up, that's a chromatic scale. If I played it in one position here, let's say I just played a chromatic scale starting on A. I played an A note and I played every fret after that. Now it's not very interesting, obviously, although there are times when you can use chromatic scales. So again, chromatic scale, all half steps. The whole tone scale is made up of only whole steps, hence the name whole tone scale. And as I mentioned, a whole tone is 2 frets. So if I played a whole tone scale on the 6th string, for example, if I hit the open E, and then I hit the whole tone, which is 2 frets, so that would be the 2nd fret, 2 steps higher, 2 frets higher would be the 4th fret, 6th fret, 8th fret, 10 and 12. So here's a whole tone scale on the 6th string. And what's interesting about the whole tone scale is every note can actually be the name or the root note of the scale, where if you played a major scale, again like a C major scale, C is the root note. The other notes are intervals of that scale, the 2nd, the 3rd, the 4th degree, and things like that. But with the whole tone scale, because of the symmetrical pattern, any note can be the name of the scale. So when I play, if I start on an E note, I'll say that's E whole tone. But I can also say it's F sharp whole tone, because if I continued on, I can get an F sharp there, G sharp, A sharp. So any note can be the name of the scale. And if you look at it from this perspective, you can think of it in terms of odd and even. In other words, if I start on E, I'll call E an even number. Even though it's an open string, well, I'll say 0 is even, because the notes after that are 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and so on. So I'll say even number frets is one whole tone scale. And then I can have the odd number frets. If I start on the first fret, I would have the odd numbers, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13, and if I continue on. So that would be F whole tone, or G whole tone, or A whole tone. So in other words, there really are only 2 whole tone scales. And you could think of it, as I said again, the even number frets or the odd numbered frets. Here's an E whole tone scale, or any of the other notes I play in that scale. For that matter, I can call the root note, but I'll just call it E because I'm starting on E. So here's an E whole tone scale in the open position. Kind of an interesting sounding scale. Every note I played is 2 frets higher than the previous note. And as I mentioned, that there are only 2 whole tone scales, in a sense, the even notes or the even numbered frets and the odd numbered frets. Now I'll start on F, and I'll play an F whole tone scale, and now in this case I won't have any open strings anymore. That's an F whole tone scale, or a G whole tone, or an A whole tone. As I mentioned, any of the notes that I play can be considered the root note. Now the nice thing about this pattern, the second one that I just played, since there are no open strings, you can now use this scale to play anywhere you want. You know, just you remember this pattern, 1, 3. If I start on the 5th fret, or A, right? So anywhere I start, just stay with that same fingering pattern, and I'll have a whole tone scale. And whichever note I played, I can call the root. But usually we would, make sense to call it from the root note, the starting point, if you will. So again, wherever I start, if I want to play G sharp or A flat whole tone, start on a G sharp note, fret 4, and play that sequence. If I play from the 8th fret, I'll have C whole tone, and so on and so on. Now, as I mentioned, that the whole tone scale is a symmetrical scale, meaning that the pattern is going to be have symmetry. It's going to be the same fingering pattern, the fact that you're playing whole tones. So here's a pattern that you can use for playing whole tone scales across the neck. The pattern I previously showed you was a vertical pattern, where you're basically staying in one area and you're crossing the strings vertically. But here's a pattern that you can play horizontally, and it's interesting because the symmetry, your fingering pattern is the same. So if I start with F, okay, I'm going to play F, G, A, and if you notice the fingers stretching out, or the layout, I play the first note, then the next note is going to be 2 frets higher, and then the next note 2 frets higher. So covering a 5 fret span using my 1st, 2nd, and 4th finger. I will not use my 3rd finger in this pattern. So string 6, I play frets 1, 3, 5 with fingers 1, 2, and 4. Then when I go to the 5th string, I'm going to start 1 fret higher, and again use that same layout with fingers 1, 2, and 4. Then I go to the 4th string, 1 fret higher, and same layout with my fingers 1, 2, and 4. When I go down to the 3rd string, I'll start 1 fret higher, add fret 4, same layout. Now when I get to string 2, I'm going to go 2 frets higher, and that's because when you tune your guitar, you can tune it. The guitar's tuned in fourths until you get to the 3rd and 2nd string. It's tuned in thirds. If you go, so you got to come back 1 fret so you have to, make up for that. Okay, so anyway, string 6 again, frets 1, 3, 5. String 5, frets 2, 4, 6. String 4, frets 3, 5, 7. When I get to string 3, 4, 6, and 8. Then when I get to string 2, I'm going to go 2 frets higher with my 1st finger, and then still retain that pattern. 1, 2, 4, and then when I get to string 1, 1 fret higher again. So if I put this together, and if I reverse it, Okay, so again, the cool thing about this pattern is the symmetry of it. Once I begin with fingers 1, 2, and 4, again 2 frets apart for each one. When I get to the next string, I drop down and go up 1 fret. When I get from string 3 to string 2, I go 2 frets higher, and then 1 fret higher again for string 1. And you have this. Interesting scale. Every note I played is 2 frets higher than the previous note. Now, Rick Derringer did something very interesting with this whole tone scale pattern. And he, again, as I said, he used this a lot in his live performances when he would do a solo spot, when actually the band would drop out and he would play by himself and just kind of go with some wild freeform soloing, mostly rock pentatonic blues scales, because Rick was more than anything else, probably a great rock guitar player. And of course, as a rock player, the pentatonic and the blues scales were sort of like your go-to scales. But again, as I mentioned, he also incorporated these whole tone scale patterns that I just showed you, and he did it in a very, very interesting way. I'll show you 4 patterns of the whole tone scale that Rick Derringer used in his solo performances. The first pattern I'm going to show you is the whole tone scale ascending and descending in fourths. What is a fourth? A fourth is the 4th degree of the scale or of the preceding note. So in other words, if I play an F note and I play the next string, the 5th string in the same fret, that's a fourth. That's a fourth. That's a fourth. If you play a note and then the next string underneath it at the same fret, you have a fourth, the interval of a fourth. Except from strings 3 and 2, you have to go 1 fret higher for string 2. So if I play a note on string 3, to get the 4th, I have to go to the next fret. If I play a note on string 3 and the same fret on string 2, that's the interval of a 3rd. So I have to go, that's a 4th, that's a 4th, that's a 4th, that's a 4th, and that's a 4th. And if you invert a 4th, you're actually playing 5ths. In other words, if I play a note on string 5, and then I go up a string at the same fret, the second note is the 5th of that note. Okay, so fourths are if you hit a note on a string and you go to the next string down at the same fret, you're playing the interval of a 4th. If you invert it and you play a note and then you go up to the higher string at the same fret, you're playing the interval of a 5th. So as I mentioned, 4 patterns Rick Derringer used at times, mixing them up in different ways. Pattern number 1 for the ascending and descending whole tone scales in fourths. I'm going to play a note starting, remember I just showed you that whole tone scale pattern. You know, you went 1, 3, then you go to the next string, like that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to play the F note, then I'm going to go to the next string, same fret, and play, that's the 4th of that. And now I'll just go to the next, start on the next note in the whole tone scale. And so as I showed you previously, we played 1, 3, those frets 1, 3, 5, and then next string. Now I'm going to hit the note, the first note, play the 4th of that, and then go to the next note, G, play the 4th of that, the A, and the 4th of that. I'm going to ascend and descend on the fingerboard in that way. So watch this. Pattern number 1, ascending and descending in fourths. Again, what I did was the pattern I showed you earlier, right, and ascending up with the same symmetrical fingering pattern. I just, after each note, I rolled over to the next string and played the 4th of that note, and that gave me a whole tone scale, ascending and descending in fourths. Okay, now I'm going to do inversion of that, or a reversal of that. And what I mean is, when the scale that I just played, each note that I played started with the lower note and then to the higher string, you know, like 6/5, 5/4, 3/2, etc., etc., and etc. What I'm going to do now is, when I get to the highest interval that I'm going to play on that scale, when I get here, instead of going to the second string and the first string, I'm going to reverse it and hit the higher string first. So I'm going to ascend by going string 6/5, 5/4, 4/3, 3/2, like that. But then when I get, as I said, to the highest area, the highest that I'm going to play, when I begin my descension, I'm going to reverse it, and instead of hitting string 2/1, 3/2, 4/3, like that, I'm going to hit string 1/2, then 2/3, 3/4. So it'll reverse the picking direction on the way down. And now, instead of hitting 2/1, I'm going to hit 1/2. Okay, so you get that? Now here's a third pattern, where the first pattern I had just showed you, I went in fourths from the low note to the higher note, and now I'm going to reverse that. Instead of hitting 6/5, 5/4, you know, like that, in these two-note sequences, instead of going, I'm going to go, so hitting the higher of the two strings first. Rick Derringer would often mute the strings as well when he would do these patterns, kind of really gives it a cooler sound. And now the last pattern is, I'm going to reverse direction on descending, like I did with the first two patterns that I showed you, where I ascended and descended with the same string direction, and then I inverted the string direction on the way down. Same idea here. So I'm, again, in this pattern where I started from the higher note of the two, like strings 5 to 6, strings 4 to 5, 3 to 4, 2 to 3, 1 to 2. When I get to the highest area, the highest note before I begin my descension, since I'm starting on the higher note first, we're starting actually in fifths, if you want to look at it that way as well. Now, instead of going, and now when I descend, I'm going to descend hitting the lower string first of the two-note groups. So here's this pattern slowly. And now, instead of 1/2, I'm going to go 2/1. And now put it together without a pause. So there are 4 patterns for whole tone scales: ascending and descending, and inverting the string order, as I showed you, where you hit the lower string and the higher string, and then the higher string and the lower string. Pattern 1. Pattern 2. 3. Pattern 4. Four cool patterns for whole tone scales as used by Rick Derringer in many of his live performances. Real cool stuff, right? I was sorry to hear about the recent passing of Rick Derringer. Rick Derringer was a tremendous guitar player. He was more than that. He was a tremendous guitar player, a singer, a composer, a music producer, and has many, many credits to his name. He's worked with some of the best in the business: Johnny Winter, Cyndi Lauper, Steely Dan, produced Weird Al Yankovic, which is something I recently found out. So his bio work resume reads like a who's who in the music business. But again, with all these credits to his name and all that he's done in the industry, still, in my opinion, what's most outstanding about him is his guitar playing, because he was just a tremendous, as I said, a tremendous rock guitar player. Of all the things that Rick Derringer has done in his career, the two things that Rick Derringer is probably most widely known for is the song Hang On Sloopy that was recorded with his group, the McCoys, in 1965. Actually, it was recorded by a group called the Strange Loves, I think, and they brought Rick Derringer in to sing on it. And there's an interesting kind of a cool guitar solo on that song, but Rick Derringer actually did not play the solo on the recording. The only thing he did on the recording is actually the lead vocal. But still, Hang On Sloopy by the McCoys is really what put Rick Derringer on the map as far as, starting to make a name for himself in the music industry. And then, of course, his association with Johnny Winter when they joined up and they formed the group Johnny Winter and that featured the song Rock and Roll Hoochie Coo, which is probably the second most important thing or the most notable thing about Rick Derringer, that he composed the song Rock and Roll Hoochie Coo, again, which appeared on the Johnny Winter album, and later he re-recorded it on his first solo album, All American Boy. But getting back to the premise of this video, the whole tone scale that Rick Derringer used in his performances, these live performances where he played these whole tone scale patterns. The first time I ever heard him play that, play that whole tone scale type pattern was when he was playing with Edgar Winter's White Trash, Edgar Winter being Johnny Winter's brother, of course. They recorded a live double album called Roadwork. I think it was recorded at the Apollo Theater in New York. But anyway, on that album, one of the songs that was a key feature song for Edgar Winter was the song Tobacco Road. It's an old blues tune that they remade and became like a real showpiece for Edgar Winter and his band. And during that song, Tobacco Road, in the live performances, Rick Derringer would have his solo spot where the band would actually drop out, as I mentioned earlier, and he would just play by himself, kind of free form, and he would play a lot of, just blues riffs and rock riffs and stuff, but also then incorporating that whole tone ascending and descending whole tone scale in fourths that I showed you, and again, what this video is based on. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please leave any questions or comments in the comments section below. And check out in the description, there's a link to my series on modes and scales that you might find interesting. I'm Dan Beagleman, and those are whole tone scales used by Rick Derringer in his solo performances. Have a nice day.